Imagine this. One night, everything is running smoothly. Trains are loaded with goods, containers are rolling across Eurasia, and billions of dollars worth of trade is moving without interruption. But the very next morning, it all comes to a sudden stop. Over 300 freight trains carrying electronics, car parts, clothing, and even food are left stranded at the border. Tens of thousands of containers pile up with no way forward. Factories waiting for parts are forced to delay production. European supermarkets expecting fresh products from abroad see shipments stuck in limbo. In total, billions of dollars in goods are frozen, unable to reach their destinations on time. This isn't just a traffic jam. It's like someone pressing a giant pause button on a vital economic artery between China and Europe. So here's the big question. Why did Poland suddenly close the gates on this railway lifeline? And just as important, how is China already building a new backup route that could completely change the future of Eurasian trade? Let's rewind and see how this crisis unfolded. Trade between China and Europe is not new. In fact, it goes back more than 2,000 years to the legendary Silk Road. Back then, merchants carried silk, spices, and precious goods across deserts and mountains on camel caravans. It was slow, risky, and exhausting, but it connected two continents and sparked one of the greatest trading eras in history. When Poland shut its rail border, the shockwaves were felt far beyond Europe. Let's break it down. First, China. For Beijing, the railways aren't just about trade, they're about strategy. The Belt and Road Initiative depends on reliable land routes to Europe. Suddenly, with Poland closed, China's carefully built logistics chain was paralyzed at its most critical point. Trains carrying electronics, machinery, auto parts, and even clothing were stuck in Belarus. Some Chinese companies had to reroute cargo back to seaports, adding weeks of delay. For firms that rely on just-in-time delivery, this was a disaster. Second, Europe. European importers, especially in Germany, were hit hard. Factories that depend on Chinese components faced shortages. Duisburg, normally buzzing with containers, saw traffic fall sharply. Retailers preparing for the holiday season found their shelves emptier than expected. Every lost container meant lost sales, higher costs, and frustrated customers. Third, Russia and Belarus. Ironically, they benefited a little. With Poland closed, Moscow promoted alternative routes, through Kaliningrad, through St. Petersburg, or even southward via Kazakhstan. But none of these could handle the same volume as the Poland corridor. Still, Russia used the crisis to argue that Europe was unreliable and that Asia should depend more on Russian-controlled routes. Finally, the logistics industry as a whole took a hit. Shipping companies had to pay more for storage, rerouting, and insurance. The whole point of the China-Europe Railway was speed and cost efficiency. But with this disruption, it suddenly became slower and more expensive, almost defeating its purpose. In short, everyone lost something. China lost momentum, Europe lost goods, and global trade lost trust. And yet Poland, by simply closing one railway checkpoint, showed just how much power it holds over the world's supply chains. On the surface, Poland said the closure was about security concerns. The drones, the military drills, the risk of foreign sabotage, all of that made the government claim it had no choice but to shut the railway. But when you look closer, the story isn't that simple. First, there's Poland's uneasy relationship with Russia and Belarus. Since the war in Ukraine, Poland has positioned itself as one of Europe's strongest anti-Russian voices. And because nearly all China-Europe trains pass through Belarus before reaching Poland, Warsaw argued that the system was too vulnerable to Russian influence. Closing the railway sent a message: we won't let Moscow use our territory for its benefit. Second, European Union politics. Inside the EU, Poland has been pushing for more recognition of its frontline role in security. By shutting the railway, Poland reminded Brussels and Berlin that it isn't just a transit country, it's a gatekeeper. If Europe wants stability, it has to respect Poland's strategic importance. Some analysts even saw it as Warsaw flexing its muscles to gain leverage in EU negotiations on funding and defense. Third, a signal to China. Poland is officially part of China's Belt and Road Initiative, but its commitment has been shaky. By closing the railway, Warsaw may have been warning Beijing that Europe won't simply hand over its logistics arteries without conditions. In other words, if you want your trains to reach Germany, you'll have to listen to us. So, was this really about drones? Or was Poland playing a bigger geopolitical game, one that uses railways not just for trade, but as a bargaining chip in global power struggles? When Poland slammed its railway gate shut, the big question became, is there another way? The answer is yes, but with problems. One option is the northern route through Russia. Trains can travel across Siberia, bypassing Poland completely, and enter Europe through Kaliningrad or the Baltic ports. But since the war in Ukraine, many European companies are reluctant to rely on Russian infrastructure. Politically, it's risky. Another option is the southern route via Kazakhstan, the Caspian Sea, and Turkey, often called the Middle Corridor. On paper, it looks promising. It connects China to Europe without touching Russian or Polish territory. But in practice, it's slower, more expensive, and limited by bottlenecks at the Caspian Sea ferry crossings. Right now, it can't handle the same massive container flow as the Poland route. A third possibility is maritime shipping. Container ships can always carry goods from China to European ports like Rotterdam or Hamburg, but that takes 30 to 40 days. Far longer than the 12 to 15 days by train. Plus, sea freight is vulnerable to its own choke points, like the Suez Canal. So, while alternatives exist, none of them can fully replace Poland. The Milosevic corridor remains the shortest, fastest, and cheapest path for China-Europe rail trade. And that's exactly why the closure created such a shock. It exposed how the entire system is overdependent on one fragile link. This raised an even bigger question. What does the future of the China-Europe railway look like if Poland keeps using this power as leverage? The crisis with Poland might look like just another border dispute, but in reality, it's a warning for the future of global trade. China's Belt and Road Initiative built the railways to make supply chains faster, cheaper, and less dependent on ocean shipping. And for years, it worked. Trains could reach Europe in half the time it took ships. But Poland's sudden closure showed the world that speed means nothing if one weak point can shut everything down. So what happens next? For China, this is a wake-up call. Beijing is already pouring money into the Middle Corridor through Kazakhstan and Turkey, trying to upgrade ports and railways there. It's also strengthening ties with Russia to keep Siberian routes open, no matter the politics. In the long run, China will likely invest in multiple backup routes so that no single country can block its trade. For Europe, the closure is a reminder that logistics security is national security. German companies, French retailers, and Italian manufacturers can't afford to have their supply chains collapse because of a decision in Warsaw. This could push the EU to fund more resilient transport networks and reduce dependence on Poland's bottleneck. For Poland, the move proved its power. By shutting one railway hub, Warsaw forced Beijing, Brussels, and Moscow to pay attention. But it's a double-edged sword. If Poland is seen as too unpredictable, China and Europe may eventually find ways to bypass it, weakening Poland's role in the long term. And for the world as a whole, the message is clear. Global trade is fragile. The same way the pandemic exposed our dependence on seaports, this incident exposed our dependence on rail corridors. A single choke point can send shockwaves across continents. In the end, Poland didn't just stop trains. It stopped the illusion that globalization is smooth and unstoppable. And as countries race to secure their supply chains, the next battle in global trade might not be fought on seas or in cyberspace, but on the quiet railway tracks running through Eastern Europe.